The following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained.
The Central Highlands of Vietnam had always been a place of untamed wilderness, where ancient forests whispered secrets to the wind and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. During the war, this unforgiving terrain became a crucial battleground. The dense jungle, with its thick canopy that allowed little sunlight to pierce through, was both a sanctuary and a death trap. Toy soldiers had long since learned to fear the jungle, not just for the Viet Cong that hid within it, but for something darker, something that seemed to prey on the minds of men, gnawing at their sanity. In late 1968, the war had taken a dark turn. Casualties were mounting, and the psychological toll on the soldiers was immense. The Tet Offensive had shaken the American forces to their core, and the realization that the enemy could strike anywhere at any time had left the troops on edge. Fear and paranoia were constant companions in the dense jungles of Vietnam. Every rustle of leaves could be a sniper, and every shadow could conceal an enemy ambush. Yet there were stories, whispers among the ranks of encounters that defied explanation. Men spoke in hushed tones of patrols that vanished without a trace, of ghostly apparitions seen in the mist, and of the jungle itself seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. On the morning of June 28, 1969, in a base camp deep within the Central Highlands, Sergeant John Jackson received new orders. The briefing was held in a small, dimly lit tent that served as the operations center. The air was thick with humidity, making it hard to breathe, and the acrid smell of sweat and cigarettes hung heavy. The men were gathered around a battered map spread out on a table, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single overhead bulb. Lieutenant Harris, a grizzled veteran with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces of the men before him. "Listen up," he growled, his voice rough from years of chain smoking. "We've got intel on a major supply route being used by the Viet Cong. Mission is to intercept and ambush any enemy convoys moving through this sector." He tapped a finger on the map, indicating a remote area of the jungle, far from any established trails. "This is no cakewalk. The area is deep in the jungle, thick canopy, treacherous terrain, and God knows what else. It's the perfect place for an ambush, but it's also the perfect place to get lost or worse. The locals don't even go there. They say it's cursed." Jackson exchanged uneasy glances with his squad. The mention of a cursed jungle was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned soldiers. But orders were orders, and Jackson was not one to question them. The target date for deployment was July 3rd, giving them 5 days to prepare. The tension in the room was palpable as the men absorbed the gravity of the mission. There was no room for error. The jungle was unforgiving, and any mistake could be fatal. The next few days were spent in a flurry of activity. The men of Jackson's squad, Private Thompson, Corporal Miller, Specialist Davis, and the newest addition, Private First Class O'Leary, busied themselves with preparations. Weapons were cleaned and checked repeatedly. Maps were studied until the routes were memorized, and each man mentally prepared himself for the ordeal ahead. The nights before the mission were restless. Jackson found himself lying awake in his bunk, listening to the distant sounds of the jungle, the chirping of insects, the calls of nocturnal animals, and the occasional rumble of artillery fire far off in the distance. His thoughts drifted to the stories he had heard, the ones whispered around campfires late at night. Stories of entire patrols disappearing, men driven mad by what they had seen or thought they had seen in the jungle. One night, as the men gathered around a small fire outside their tent, O'Leary, the youngest and most inexperienced member of the squad, asked a question that had been on everyone's mind. "Sarge, you ever hear of the Phantom Squad?" His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if he feared the answer. Jackson looked up from his map, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. The others fell silent, their attention now focused on their sergeant. "Yeah, "I've heard the stories," Jackson replied, his voice steady but with an edge of unease. "Supposedly, they were a recon team sent out a few months back. Went into a part of the jungle no one's ever mapped. They never came back." "What happened to them?" Thompson asked, leaning forward, his expression one of both curiosity and fear. "Official report says they were ambushed by the VC, but," Jackson hesitated, glancing around at the shadows that danced at the edge of the firelight. "Some say they weren't killed by the enemy. They say the jungle took them." The words hung in the air like a heavy mist. The men exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over them. On the morning of July 3rd, 1969, the squad departed. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the base as they shouldered their packs and set off. The jungle was already alive with the sounds of the day birds calling, insects buzzing, and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, but the men moved in silence, their faces grim and focused. The weight of their mission and the stories they had heard hung over them like a dark cloud. First few hours of the march were uneventful. The jungle was dense, the undergrowth thick and tangled, making progress slow and arduous. The heat was oppressive, the humidity clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Every step was a struggle, the ground uneven and treacherous. Jackson led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of danger. Behind him, Thompson, Miller, Davis, and O'Leary followed, their weapons at the ready. As the day wore on, the jungle seemed to close in around them. The canopy above grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight and casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. The further they went, the more isolated they felt, as if they were the only living beings in a world that had been forgotten by time. By late afternoon, the squad reached a small clearing where they decided to take a short break. The men sat in silence, their eyes scanning the jungle around them, alert for any signs of movement. O'Leary took a sip from his canteen, his hand trembling slightly. "This place, it doesn't feel right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jackson nodded in agreement, though he said nothing. The jungle had a way of playing tricks on the mind, making even the most rational man question what he saw and heard. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. The sounds of the jungle, once a comforting backdrop, now seemed alien, filled with an eerie dissonance that set their nerves on edge. As night began to fall, the squad reached their designated ambush site, narrow paths flanked by steep hills, covered in dense underbrush. The location was ideal, offering both cover and a clear line of sight for the ambush. The men quickly set up their positions, checking their weapons and laying in wait for the enemy convoy. The tension was palpable as they settled in, the darkness of the jungle pressing in around them. Jackson glanced at his watch. It was just after 2,100 hours. Convoy was expected to pass through the area within the next few hours. The men knew they had to remain silent, still, and focused. But as the minutes ticked by, the oppressive silence of the jungle began to weigh on them. The usual sounds of the night, the chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves were conspicuously absent, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, as if the night itself was closing in around them. The air was cold now, far colder than it should have been in the humid jungle. Jackson could see the tension in his men, the way they gripped their weapons just a little tighter, their eyes darting to every shadow. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The jungle was now completely silent, an unnatural stillness that only served to heighten their anxiety. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jackson saw movement. He turned, his heart pounding, but saw nothing, just the darkness, impenetrable and suffocating. "Stay sharp," he whispered to his men, his voice barely audible. "Something's not right." Hours passed, and the convoy had yet to arrive. The men remained in their positions, but the tension was becoming unbearable. The silence of the jungle was oppressive, the darkness absolute. Jackson's mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. They had followed the intel to the letter, chosen the perfect spot for the ambush. So why hadn't the convoy come through? Suddenly, a faint rustling sound broke the silence. Jackson tensed, his grip tightening on his rifle. The sound was coming from the jungle behind them. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Miller, who was closest to him. Miller nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, I heard it." The rustling grew louder, closer. Jackson felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Stay calm," he ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. It could be an animal. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It was as if something was moving through the jungle, circling them. O'Leary, who was positioned on the far side of the clearing, suddenly let out a low gasp. "Sarge, over there," he whispered urgently, pointing towards the darkness. Jackson turned, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, he saw nothing, just the shadows of the jungle shifting and moving in the darkness. But then he saw a figure, barely visible, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was humanoid, but something was off. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the head too large. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching them. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. "What the hell is that?" Thompson whispered, his voice trembling. Jackson didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure. It was almost as if he was waiting for something. He raised his rifle, aiming at the figure, but something in his gut told him not to pull the trigger. The figure made no move, no sound. It simply stood there, an unsettling presence in the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Jackson blinked, his heart racing. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaky. The others nodded, their faces pale. "What the hell was that thing?" Davis asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jackson shook his head, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. "Don't know, but we need to stay focused. Keep your eyes peeled." The encounter had rattled them, but they couldn't afford to lose their nerve. The jungle was playing tricks on them, that much was clear. But they couldn't let fear get the best of them. They were soldiers, trained to handle any situation, but deep down, Jackson knew that this was something beyond their training, something they couldn't explain. As the night wore on, the jungle seemed to come alive with a malevolent presence. The rustling sounds grew more frequent, more deliberate, as if something was moving through the underbrush, watching them, stalking them. The men were on edge, their nerves frayed. Every sound, every shadow sent a jolt of fear through them. Then the whispers started. At first, Jackson thought it was just the wind, carrying the sounds of the jungle through the trees. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were voices faint, disembodied, echoing through the darkness. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, mocking. "Do you hear that?" Miller asked, his voice trembling. Jackson nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Yeah, I hear it." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around them, echoing through the trees, the underbrush, the very air they breathed. Jackson felt a cold dread settle over him. The jungle was alive with voices, with the spirits of the dead, and they were not welcome here. The men huddled together, their backs to each other, trying to ward off the encroaching darkness. The whispers grew louder still, filling their minds with dread. Jackson could feel the fear gnawing at him, eroding his sanity. The jungle was alive, malevolent, and it was closing in on them. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, like the sound of a tree falling. The ground shook beneath them, sending a wave of panic through the squad. Jackson spun around, his rifle at the ready, but saw nothing, just the darkness, impenetrable and suffocating. "What the hell was that?" Thompson asked, his voice filled with fear. "I don't know, but we need to stay together," Jackson replied, his voice steady despite the terror he felt. "Keep your eyes open. Whatever's out there, we need to be ready for it." The night dragged on, the whispers and rustling sounds growing louder, more insistent. The darkness seemed to press in on them, suffocating, oppressive. Jackson could feel his sanity slipping away, the fear gnawing at his mind. The jungle was alive, and it was coming for them. As the hours passed, the men grew more and more desperate. They were trapped, surrounded by an unseen enemy that seemed to be toying with them, driving them to the brink of madness. The whispers grew louder still, filling their minds with terror. The rustling sounds grew closer, more deliberate, as if something was moving through the jungle, circling them, stalking them. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, the whispers and rustling sounds ceased. The jungle fell silent once more. as if the darkness had retreated. But the damage had been done. The men were exhausted, their nerves frayed, their minds teetering on the brink of madness. As the sun rose over the jungle, casting long shadows over the clearing, Jackson and his men finally allowed themselves to relax, if only for a moment. The night had been a nightmare, filled with terror and dread, but now, in the light of day, they could finally catch their breath. The men sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. They had survived the night. But at what cost? The jungle had taken something from them, something intangible, but real nonetheless. Jackson glanced around at his men, seeing the toll the night had taken on them. Thompson was trembling, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Miller stared blankly ahead, his eyes glazed over as if in a trance. Davis was muttering to himself, his words incoherent. O'Leary was the worst off, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white, his breath coming in short. Shallow gasps. "We need to get out of here," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "This place is not right. We need to get back to base, regroup." The others nodded in agreement, their faces pale and drawn. The night had been a waking nightmare. None of them wanted to stay in this cursed jungle any longer than necessary. Jackson led the way, his eyes scanning the jungle around them, alert for any signs of danger. The daylight brought little comfort. The jungle was still dense, still oppressive, still filled with an unnerving silence. The shadows seemed to stretch out towards them as if reaching for them, trying to pull them back into the darkness. As they made their way back to base, the men were on edge, their nerves frayed. Every sound, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through them. The jungle was alive, and it was still watching them. The squad finally emerged from the jungle, battered and broken, their minds haunted by the events of that fateful night. They had survived, but they would never be the same. The jungle had taken something from them, something they could never get back. Back at base, Jackson filed his report detailing the mission, the ambush that never happened, and the inexplicable events that had unfolded in the jungle. But he knew that no one would believe him. The official story would be that the squad had encountered enemy forces and been forced to retreat. But Jackson knew the truth: the jungle was alive and it had come for them. As the months passed, the squad was gradually reassigned, dispersed to different units. The events of that night were never spoken of again, but they remained etched in the minds of those who had experienced it. The jungle had a way of getting under your skin, of staying with you long after you had left it behind. For Jackson, the memories of that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The whispers, the rustling sounds, the figure in the darkness, they were all burned into his mind, a reminder of the terror he had faced in the depths of the jungle. The war would eventually come to an end, but for Jackson and his men, the battle was far from over. The jungle had taken something from them, something they could never get back. As long as they lived, they would never forget the haunting shadows of Vietnam.